This video marks the start of a bunch of shorter videos within the main garden room series aimed at answering your questions, clarifying and elaborating on things from the existing videos, and covering smaller topics that I haven't been able to fit in elsewhere. For this first video, we're going to take a closer look at the 15cm rule, whether we need or should abide by it, and then we'll explore the intricacies of where you measure the height of an outbuilding from and to, which is a little more nuanced than one might first think. Let's go. Back in part 4, when I was building my block pier foundations, I mentioned that they were raised 15cm off the ground, which is a building regs rule designed for two reasons. The first is to prevent rain from hitting the ground and then splashing back up onto your wall. For brick-built houses, this water can soak through the walls, so if the internal floor joists were lower than 15cm, moisture might wick through and rot the floor. For timber buildings with a breathable membrane on the outside, the wall is protected, but your cladding is at risk if it's made from timber. Having overhangs on all four sides really helps with this issue, but box-type garden rooms are more at risk. The second reason is that the gap is to allow airflow under the joists, and 15cm allows for a decent interchange of air, which is what the air bricks are designed for in a brick house. Fair enough, two good reasons, but there are two problems as well. The first is that you end up with a big gap under your garden room, which you then have to hide either by bringing the cladding down to ground level or by building a deck around it. The second problem is that for garden rooms built within 2 meters of a boundary, under permitted development, we have to work to a maximum height of 2.5 meters, and using up 15cm of that for the gap just isn't feasible. Fortunately, we can discard this rule as building regs doesn't apply for a garden room under 30 meters squared internal floor space. But what's the minimum gap we can have for ventilation? When deviating from building standards, there is some guesswork involved, so my best guess is that 5cm would be adequate, based on the fact that that is what is stipulated for ventilation and airflow in the space above the insulation in a cold roof design. 5cm is enough to keep your floor joists off the ground and to allow ventilation, and we claw back 10cm, which can go towards the ceiling height instead. So with a 5cm gap, 120mm floor timber, and 18mm ply or OSB, and then laminate flooring, you're up to around 20cm. We want a minimum of 2.1 meters for internal ceiling height, which only leaves 20cm for your roof. That means you definitely need to opt for a thinner cold roof, and allowing for the OSB top deck and plasterboard underneath the roof joist, your span and therefore width of your garden room can't be more than 4.3 meters, because any wider would require roof joists too thick, and you'd end up either reducing your ceiling height below 2.1 meters or having to go over the 2.5 meter permitted development height. So with all this in mind, you may conclude that a concrete base is better, because with no timber and no air gap required, your floor starts at 5cm rather than 19cm off the ground. However, it's not quite a fair fight, as the timber floor can be insulated, whereas the finished concrete is not. But we'll look at how to insulate a concrete floor in another video. So all this begs the question of why did I go for that 15cm gap? Well, firstly, I had planning for a 3 meter height, so I had more room to play with. And secondly, I couldn't actually go any lower due to the height of the land at the back of the garden room. So while the gap under my garden room is 15cm, give or take due to the slope of the land, my floor timbers are only a couple of centimetres above ground at the back, and I had to use some flashing to ensure the floor wouldn't get wet. So this all gives me a nice segue to the question of where do you measure the height of your garden room from, and can we perhaps eke out a bit more height? If you've got a level site, you've probably not given this much consideration, but with slope sites like mine, which drop around 40cm from the back left to the front right, where the measurement is taken from makes a big difference. The mini guide to outbuildings gives nothing away, but is hidden in the Permitted Development Statutory Instruments Guide, which states, and I'm paraphrasing here, ground level, where the level of the surface of the ground is not uniform, is the level of the highest part of the surface of the ground adjacent to it. So that's great news. That means the height of my building can be measured from the back left, where the ground is highest. So what if your ground is really steep? In that case, what you could do is excavate the soil so you have a flat base level with the lowest soil, and then build a retaining wall to hold back the earth here. You could then build to the usual permitted development height like so, but if you want to go higher than that and still be within permitted development rules, you would have to build your back wall touching the retaining wall, or indeed incorporate the retaining wall into the wall itself. You would then measure from the top of the retaining wall and therefore achieve a much higher internal height while still under permitted development. To demonstrate this point to the extreme, a website called Planning Jungle have mocked up this image, which would, if this height here were no more than 2.5 meters, would be 100% legal. Of course, I wouldn't be too pleased if I lived in this house though. If I could get a do-over of my build, this might be the way I'd do it. One of the reasons I didn't go for a concrete base was because to raise it above ground level at the back left would have meant that to be level with the front right, it would have needed to be ridiculously thick. But if I built a retaining wall along the back and left walls, I could have had a thinner slab that was level with the ground at the front, and then I could have used the retaining walls as the base for my garden room walls. Think of them a bit like dwarf walls, but below ground level. If you do go down this route, make sure you use dense concrete blocks, and you'll need to use bitumen on the outside to waterproof them before filling the soil back in. If you're going to use timber above, then you can use insulated plasterboard on the inside over the whole wall to insulate, or just build another stud wall inside and fill with insulation. Anyway, that's cleared up where we measure from, but where do we measure to? For garden rooms within 2 metres of a boundary, it's pretty clear. The maximum height is 2.5 metres, so therefore it's not just a case of measuring the wall which sits above the highest ground level. For my build, putting aside that I had planning permission, I'd measure from the back left, where the ground is highest, to the tip top of the edge trim on the front overhang, as that's the highest. For outbuildings more than 2 metres away from the boundaries, it's a lot more complex, and I kind of glossed over this when I first covered it in part 2. This time it gives 2 different maximum heights depending on the style of roof, but again you need to measure to the highest point of each. However, there is a second height limitation you need to build to, which is the eaves height. The dotted line in the mini guide is pretty ambiguous, but my initial assumption was that the eaves height would be to the underside of the soffit, but it's not. It turns out it's to the upper side of the roof directly above the outside of the wall, which is a shame in regards to how high you can build. The only information I've been able to find out about eaves height is for house extensions, but as I interpret it, for flat or monopitch roofs, it would be the lower wall where this rule would apply, and you'd have to measure from the ground level adjacent to that wall. You can't pick any wall. However, if the land slopes along that wall, you can pick the highest point. Pretty confusing, but hopefully that's clarified the rules surrounding garden room heights. There is a little bit of interpretation involved, but it's important to note that you're not going to get a visit from your council unless someone actually complains. So as long as you can demonstrate that you've shown consideration to the rules, you'll likely be alright. As a bit of a footnote, if the thought has crossed your mind of piling up a mound of earth and measuring from the top of it, yeah, nice try, but no cigar. It's the original level of the ground, hence why my arrow points to below the retaining wall. You can do as much landscaping as you like, but technically that height doesn't change, though of course it's pretty hard to say where it was once the ground level has been changed. I'll probably skip around quite a bit in this series, but the next couple will also be on the floor and foundations, as I know many of you are starting your builds at this time of year, and if there are any topics you think I should cover, do let me know. Have a good week, everyone.